All right, got it fixed. So this is one of my sketchbook pages, double page actually, which is composed primarily of portraits of fellow artists. Now, first off, that's the reference photograph of Lakota Phillips, and I wanted to do use a pull-away technique, or basically what you do is after you put the paint on, which you'll see, you pull out highlights by using a wet brush and lifting up the paint off the surface. Now this sketchbook, the pages are really absorbent. The paint absorbs really quickly, so you couldn't really do that technique very well even with watercolor, which is what I'm going to use. So what I did was, you can sort of see a shine on the page, or on the pages, and that is because I put a layer of gloss medium on it, so the paint will sit on top and meld and hopefully show some interesting textures, some of the brush strokes that are left behind. And I should be able to lift the paint off relatively easily because it won't have that much to soak into. It just has to dry by the air. I don't know why I end up feeling like every painting I do is an experiment. I shouldn't feel that way after all this time. But anyway, this one sort of feels like it. I'm going to try and apply some color in some large amounts of color in areas and sort of let it flow together, and then lift out the highlights and then darken the darks using watercolor instead of ink. But I might use some ink to darken up some darks later, and maybe even add some highlights if I have to. So let us begin the experiment. What will be somewhat tricky is, will I be able to see my pencil lines once I, let all this paint flow over everything? That will be the tricky part. And I won't really know until it's somewhat dry. You may be able to see it to some degree when it's wet, but for the most part, I won't be able to tell. One option would have been to use some ink and establish those darks, but I sort of felt that would have ended up looking sort of artificial, so I didn't do that. And right now it just is sort of intuitive as to what colors I put where and how much. And should I leave some areas without paint at all? This is the eternal quandary facing the artist. Or maybe it's just me. It looks like I can pretty much see the pencil lines behind this paint. So far, that part's covered. It's very, very possible I could totally screw this up. It's always an option. It's always a feature. But you can see how it's sliding off, and you might not be able to tell that it's not totally soaking in, but it isn't. Unfortunately, some of this paint is probably going to seep into the pages on the other side where there's already a painting, but it's just a sketchbook, so I shouldn't be that worried about it. But now I'm getting close to the point where I'm going to put this down and start pulling out or wiping away some areas, but I also need to look to make sure that I have enough of the paint in some of these areas that the shadow areas will be covered by paint. And I don't want to overdo these sort of linear marks. I want to try and keep it fluid looking. Okay, I probably should stop the painting for now at least. I'm just blotting some of the bottom areas so it doesn't just soak through the other side too much, hopefully. Okay. So now you can see the mess that I will be pulling the picture out of, hopefully. All right. So now get a wet brush and try to see the areas that I need to pull out. You can see how it comes right off for the most part. There are some watercolors that are more staining than others. You know, they soak in quickly and they can't be lifted off very easily, whereas other colors, it's a lot easier to do that. And some of this paint's still wet, so that might be good because it might make some of these areas blend a little bit into the other areas, so it's not just a total white line. And I'm sure I'll probably go in and darken some of these other areas too once I get this part under control. So I just go back and forth from the water jug, and sometimes I'll squeeze the water out between my fingers in between doing that. There's one of my favorite commercial illustrators by the name of David Grove, who would end up with using this sort of technique, except I think he did it with oil and I think with gouache, if I remember correctly. But it was an awful lot of pulling paint off once you applied it. And you can end up with some nice organic looking shapes. And admittedly, a lot of times it works better on more weathered shapes and faces. Not necessarily women's faces, that you might want to be softer, younger women's faces anyway. But you can still pull it off, literally and figuratively. But the good point about having color in some of these areas in the first place is a lot of times a little bit of it will be left behind, which ends up making it look a little bit more painterly and organic rather than a lot of sort of tightly rendered areas, really labored areas. But you can already see the shape starting to take shape out of the background here. I just have to be very careful as to where I start pulling off. And it's hard to get really soft blends, I think, like from a really light area where my brush is now to fading out down here. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, you can see the face, and you can actually even see it probably better than I can, because technically your viewpoint's a tiny bit further away from mine. So just like when you squint and you just see the basic shapes of something, you can see it a little bit better than me. And I wanted to do this technique partially because I want the eyes and some of these darker areas to just sort of fade into the background and just focus on some of the areas that are in the light. The dilemma will come when I have to decide how much actual brushing on of paint I want to do once I'm done with this part of the process, because I don't want, in the process of doing that, to end up looking sort of artificial. I like the way these areas end up looking, if it's done correctly. Sorry, the phone might be shaking a tiny bit because one leg of the tripod is resting against the table, but there's not a lot I can do about it. Get that piece of paint out of there. Okay. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how many people are here and how many people stick around. And I've got music on my headphones as usual. Right now it's this relatively young guy by the name of Justin Nozuka. and it's hard to pull out these highlights in the case of some of these shadows of the hair, and actually make it look like shadows of hair. Got to pay attention to some of the landmarks here. Where do I pull this stuff out? It'll start to look even better once I add some paint and darken up some of these shadow areas, but right now I'm just trying to pull out these shadows, or pull out these areas where the light's still hitting the face. But at least I think it's going to end up hopefully looking interesting, if nothing else. So I try and line up the landmark of this nostril here to a lit area. A certain spot. Hands that end up looking like this with paint all over them from squeezing out the brush. And again, as always, I always appreciate the likes, the comments, and especially the shares, so that it gets out to more people than it would normally. This won't necessarily look a lot like Lakota when I'm done, but hopefully it will at least look like an interesting painting. See, who can tell what this song is from my off-tuned whistling? Well, thanks for watching, Zerathul, if I pronounced your name right. Get some rest. Oh, and now it's some old Elton John razor face. I think I need to get some more paint. At least a few of these colors anyway. I'll try to direct the flow of some of this so these things I'm adding after can look organic, hopefully. Oops, I'm missing. Oh, there's Lakota. Yeah, I will definitely, get you a copy. And I'll give you one big enough so you can print from it if you want to, Lakota. Help me find Nevada, California. Hey, thanks, Doc. Appreciate that. The trick right now, I think, is to be able to add some of these other strokes, but have them still look integrated, like they haven't necessarily been added later. Not easy. These sketchbooks, this is one thing you don't have a lot of control over, is the gutter and the marks that it might leave behind. just a continuous process of adding and taking away. All right, Ken, thanks for watching. Don't eat too much. Right now I'm listening to Sally Oldfield, Mike Oldfield's sister. Most people know Mike Oldfield from Tubular Bells, that soundtrack that was used for The Exorcist. But he actually had a band with his sister Sally before that. And then she went on to make several solo albums herself. Nobody's watching. Well, I guess it's dinner time for a lot of people. One thing that I could have done, for those of you that are going to maybe look at this and listen later, is when I applied the gloss medium over the drawing, I could have had the strokes follow things like the path of the hair, for example, and that would show up to some degree in the final painting. But I sort of wanted stuff to be more, I wanted everything to sort of be integrated so that these various brushstrokes would continue behind different shapes. probably wondering if it's close to the time when I should stop. Yeah, I think I should probably stop here pretty soon. Okay, I think I better stop. No one's watching at this point, but maybe they'll tune in later, sign this thing, and get on with the rest of my evening. Thanks, those of you that tuned in, those of you that tune in later, those of you that share, comment, etc., etc. I'll see you later.